They never buried the dead, not in that soil, not in that orchard. Beneath the roots of those trees, something older than scripture breathes, and it remembers the names of those who tried to leave. But before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there right now? Drop it below. That detail might matter more than you think. You see, in the spring of 1839, a man stepped onto land that had already been warned off by weather, war, and whispers. His name was Elias Fairbanks, and his smile carried the kind of silence that swallows sound. He spoke softly, quoting scripture in strange cadence, as though rehearsing verses older than the Bible. The locals thought him odd, but not dangerous. That was their first mistake. He bought 40 acres of abandoned orchard on the outskirts of Andover County. Soil so black it stained your boots, so damp it swallowed footsteps. No one asked why he paid in coin older than the US Treasury. No one asked why the deed was filed by a surveyor who left town before the week was out, but they should have. By summer, a narrow timber chapel stood where the earth used to reject even weeds. No cross, no bell, no name, just wood and silence. His wife, Ada, tended vines that never fruited, vines that curled like veins across her hands. She never spoke above a whisper. Some swore she hummed to the earth. The 3 children, Nell, Mercy, and the boy they simply called Rev, were pale as moonlit ash. They didn't attend school. They didn't need to. People noticed, but they didn't intervene. Why? Because Elias made them feel seen. Because his gatherings, held by candlelight among the dead pear trees, didn't preach, didn't sing. They just were. Stillness, salt, the sound of dirt shifting under bare feet. It was church for those who had lost faith, and something older, something, darker, answered. No one knew what it was, but they felt it, and that was enough. The land had been tried twice before by revivalists. Both times it had failed, rejected preachers, promises, and pilgrims alike, but not Elias, not his family. They stayed, they flourished, and they changed. Things. By 1840, they had built a second structure. No one saw it rise, no one heard the hammering. One day it was just there, smaller than the chapel, built from stone, no windows, an iron door, thick enough to hold in storms, or something else. When asked what it was for, Elias only said, containment. Containment of what? No one dared ask again. His words were soft, but they sat inside you like iron, like truth disguised as faith, like secrets pretending to be salvation. You feel that weight already, don't you? Good. You're beginning to see what they never did, and from here on out, every step you take is a step away from the world you knew. Don't stop walking. The first to disappear was not listed as missing. Her name was Catherine Holt, 17, flame-haired and far too curious. The kind of girl who walked roads alone just to feel the silence challenge her. Her mother said she left for a lesson with Mercy Fairbanks, who had begun tutoring girls labelled too wild for school. No one questioned it. The Fairbanks girls were strange, yes, but quiet, harmless, or so it was believed. Catherine left with her hands clasped in prayer. No coat, no lantern, into the orchard, into the frost. She was never seen again. They searched, of course, not with alarm, yet Elias led the men himself, guiding them without compass or map like the land whispered to him. 3 days they wandered the woods. 3 days they found nothing but silence and the faint smell of sap. Then the search just ended. No announcement, no funeral, no grave. Her mother stopped speaking altogether. Her porch lamp stayed lit for nearly a year, and when asked why she kept it burning, she simply said she might need to find her way back. But the truth, she already had. Just not in the way they hoped. The Reverend Tillman, a local preacher who once tried to baptize the Fairbanks boy, was asked about Catherine years later. He went pale. His voice cracked as he whispered, Some girls are born closer to the veil than others. He never elaborated. But the veil, if that's what it was, had started thinning. In February of 1841, a physician named Alton Greaves stopped in Andover County, delayed by snow. A man of science, strict and methodical, he had no patience for folklore or country superstition. And yet, on his second night, he attended a Fairbanks gathering, pure curiosity, or so he claimed. What he witnessed changed him. His notes, scribbled in the margins of his almanac, tell the tale. He described a chapel lit only by a dozen tallow candles, shadows swaying like they had weight, no hymns, no voices, just Elias reading aloud from a book with no markings. The language, unknown. The effect, devastating. Women wept, tears sliding in silence. Men shook with an inner tremble, fists clenched like holding something back. Then the boy, Rev, stepped forward, small, pale, eyes too still. He reached out, placed his hand on a young man's forehead. The man collapsed, convulsing. No one moved. No one helped. They all watched. Greaves wrote that the silence after the collapse was thicker than any scream, that it wrapped around the room like a cloak, that when he left the next morning he refused food, refused escort, and muttered 5 words over and over again. They're not burying the dead. He left town that night. Never practiced medicine again, and still the gatherings grew. Because what they felt in that chapel wasn't fear, it was power. And power, true, ancient power, always demands a sacrifice, not in blood necessarily, not at first, but something had been awakened under the roots of that orchard, and it was hungry, still are. You feel it now, don't you? Good, that means your ears are finally open. The boy from the Mayweather farm came back marked. Not from war, not from labour, but from worship. 3 cross-hatched scratches ran across his chest, deep, clean, deliberate. His mother screamed when she saw them, tried to clean the wounds. He wouldn't let her, said they were part of a ritual cleansing, that they were holy, that she told him it had to be done. When asked who she was, he wouldn't say, but his sister claimed he'd been spending time with Nell Fairbanks, alone, beneath the orchard trees where the soil cracked like burnt parchment and the branches didn't move in the wind. She said they hummed when no one was watching and that her brother started humming too. By autumn, the stories spread like mould, quiet, slow and hungry. A whisper here, a rumour there. At first, just nervous laughter over fences, but the laughter faded because the stories kept aligning. The sheriff's dog disappeared after chasing something into the orchard. A newborn cried non-stop for 9 nights after the mother accepted Mercy's help during the birth. Cattle refused to pass the northern ridge, circling instead until their hooves bled. And the preacher, the circuit rider sent by the diocese to confront Elias about unsanctioned gatherings, he arrived one evening and left the next month, resigned, silent, ashen. He refused to tell anyone what he saw. He simply packed and rode east, never stopping to preach again. 2 families followed him out of Andover. No farewell, no reason. Their homes were left stocked, meat salted, wood chopped, lanterns full, but their fields were untouched, abandoned at harvest. Something had shaken them deeper than fear. It had shown them something, and that something had stolen the language to explain it. But the orchard, it remained. No snow ever settled on its branches, not even during the deepest winters. The trees stayed wet where others, with sap, cold, clear, and always dripping. Some said it looked like tears. Others said it looked like something darker, like blood, diluted by time. Either way, it never froze, even when every lake in the county was locked under ice. In March of 1842, something shifted. Something began reaching out. It started with the letters. Thin, brittle parchment delivered to the hands of certain women, always the mothers, never the fathers. Each note sealed in wax, stamped with the symbol of a split fig. No name, no return address, only 8 words. We have seen her sorrow. We can return what was taken. The first woman to respond was Clara Dunn. Her infant had died during childbirth the previous winter. She walked the orchard path alone just before dusk. She returned with nothing but a blanket, a muslin square she swore was the same one she buried with her daughter. When asked what she saw, what they gave her, she only said, "He let me hold her again, but not for long." That night, Clara built a fire taller than her roof, stood beside it until morning, tossed something into the flames. No one asked what it was, they already knew. From then on, Clara never entered another church, only the orchard, only the silence. Because what they were offering wasn't resurrection, it was worse, it was remembrance, and sometimes, remembering hurts more than death. By the time Rev turned 12, no one called him a child. He wasn't raised, he was revealed. That's what one of the old-timers said. His words slurred over whiskey, his hands trembling around the glass like something unseen still held them. That boy didn't grow, he was waiting. He never attended school, never played in the road. He walked barefoot even in the frost, the soles of his feet blackened by the orchard's earth, but never blistered, never scarred. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the words landed like iron dropped in water, still on the surface, but deep where you couldn't see. At the midsummer gathering of 1843, Rev stepped out before 27 settlers, men, women, and even a few children. No podium, no text, just his voice, soft and terrible in its precision. He began naming names. None from the county, none known to anyone there, but each followed by a date, each uttered without hesitation. Some laughed, nervously, unsure what they were witnessing, but all of them remembered what they heard, and weeks later, those names began to mean something. A family of travelers was found dead at Black Timber Creek, wagon intact, goods untouched, but their bodies marked. The same cross-hatched symbols the Mayweather boy once wore, etched deeper now, carved as if with purpose. The date they were found matched the one Rev had whispered that night. Still, no accusations were made. The sheriff blamed highwaymen, everyone nodded and said nothing, because deep down they knew Rev didn't prophesy. He declared. And when he spoke, the orchard listened. By the next year, the trees began to bloom in the wrong season, out of rhythm, out of reason. Pale blossoms curled from twisted limbs in the middle of August. No bees came, no fruit followed, just petals, and something under the soil. Children who wandered too close said they heard humming, not like music, not like wind, but like breath. Heavy, rhythmic, alive. One girl, Sarah Bell, swore she saw hands beneath the roots, pale, bone-thin, folding and unfolding like they were praying. Her parents sent her away the next day to cousins in Boston. She never spoke of it again. But she didn't forget. None of them did. Because something old had rooted itself into that land, and it was waking up. It carved a path through the trees, not with axes, not with tools, but with weight. Broad indentations, even, measured. They glowed under moonlight, faintly, like heat rising from flesh. And that was where Elias began leading the gatherings. Down that path, carrying nothing but a single glass lantern, no Bibles, no cross, only salt and silence. The people who returned were never the same. Some walked home smiling, radiant, like they'd been healed of a disease no one knew they had. Others didn't speak for days. A boy named Ezra tried to follow the path alone one night. He came back before sunrise, barefoot, bleeding and wordless. His tongue had been neatly severed. His boots were never found. The orchard kept them, because the orchard always takes something in return, and by now it had begun choosing. They didn't arrive by wagon, they didn't ride in with traders or families. They came on foot, solitary figures, silent, pale, clothed in garments stitched with symbols the town couldn't translate, spirals inside spirals, lines like vines curling through alphabets no one recognized. Their eyes were dry from wind, but they did not blink. By harvest of 1845, 7 strangers had appeared in Andover. No one saw where they slept, no one saw where they went after nightfall. But they were always near the orchard, just at its edge, watching, listening, waiting for something no one else could hear. One of them, a woman with hair like ash and eyes like wet stone, knelt beside the Fairbanks chapel for 13 hours without moving. Farmers passed her in the early light and again in the evening, same position, same stillness. At dusk, she stood up and walked into the woods. She was never seen again. The sheriff said nothing, not because he didn't notice, but because by then, silence had become safer than truth. Even the soil had changed. It swallowed tools, blunted axes, made fence posts rot in days. The dogs refused to go near it. One old hound, loyal to the Tanner family for 9 winters, leapt from their porch one evening and ran full speed into the trees. They found him 2 days later. His body was unmarked. His eyes were gone, not gouged, not torn, just absent, as if removed by something that didn't need to tear, something that knew how to open. And that winter, Mercy Fairbanks began walking house to house. No longer with invitations, no more parchment, no seals. She brought offers, soft-spoken, direct. Would you like to see him again? That's what she said to Henry Cobb's wife. Their son had drowned the year before under a frozen lake. The body hadn't been recovered until spring. His mother said yes. She returned from the orchard the next morn, with damp hands and seaweed tangled in her shawl. She said she'd spoken to him, said he remembered the song she sang to him as a child. She didn't smile when she said it. She just stared. Days later, her husband found her in the barn, curled in a pile of wet hay, mouth open, eyes rolled back, whispering a lullaby into the rafters. Her voice was too high, too strained, like it was being pulled through her. She never sang again. And still, more people came. Because grief is an open wound. And the Fairbanks, they promised it could be filled, not healed, not closed, just filled, with memory, with presence, with something that smelled like love but was built from hunger. You see it now, don't you? They weren't offering peace, they were offering access. And through that orchard, something was crossing over. Piece by piece, name by name. And soon, it would no longer need to ask. It would be invited. In the spring of 1846, the stones began to bleed. Not like a metaphor, not in poetry or fable, literally. Small, flat stones, set in a circle near the second structure, the one with the iron door, began to seep a thick, rust-coloured fluid that darkened the earth beneath them. Locals said it was just iron runoff, some trick of the soil. But those who touched it felt something else. Heat, rhythm, like a pulse. One man, Howard Finch, reached down during one of the gatherings, pressing his fingers into the warm stone. He recoiled instantly, said it felt like touching a heartbeat. That night he tried to leave Andover with his family. He made it as far as the county line before his wagon snapped clean in half. Both oxen were dead, still harnessed, their eyes wide, tongues blackened. He returned the next morning, and he never tried to leave again. By summer, that second structure, the stone one with no windows, began humming. Not daily, not constantly, only at dusk. The kind of hum that wasn't heard but felt, like teeth grinding inside your spine. Children in nearby farms began sleepwalking, always toward the orchard, always barefoot, even through brambles and frost. Their feet never bled, they never cried. When woken, they all said the same thing. She's teaching us. No one ever saw her. Not clearly. But figures were glimpsed between the trees, thin, bent, draped in shadow, moving with a precision that felt rehearsed. Nell Fairbanks was seen walking with one of them, hand in hand at moonrise, her dress trailing through dirt that swallowed footprints, her face serene, her mouth moving soundlessly. She didn't return for 3 days. When she did, her hair had gone white. She never spoke again. But her writing changed. She began etching symbols into barn doors, rocks, even skin. The tanner boy claimed she carved a word into his back with the edgy of a deer bone, said it didn't hurt, said it felt like permission. No one ever saw the word, because his father whipped him bloody and burned the shirt he was wearing. But the boy kept smiling, like something had bloomed inside him. And that's what the Fairbanks had learned to plant. Not crops, not fruit, but change. Internal, silent, permanent. By now, the gatherings weren't just from Andover. People came from other counties, places farther out. They walked, they followed rumours, stories passed through markets and prayer circles and whispered confessions. They can bring him back. She remembers the name. He touched me and I slept for 3 days, but when I woke I wasn't sick anymore. And still, no one spoke of what happened inside the iron-doored structure. Because those who went in didn't talk, they just watched. Stared at you like they were waiting for you to blink first, like they knew something that would crush you if spoken aloud. And maybe they did. Because Elias said little, but the orchard said everything. It rustled without wind, it wept without rain, and under the soil something moved in time with a rhythm not of this world, something that was learning us. If you're still here, then you are learning too, and that means it's time to make a choice. Comment below with the phrase, "I see what waits beneath." Twice, once to speak it into being, and again to never forget what you are becoming. By late 1846, time had begun to fracture, not in clocks, not in calendars, in memory. People began forgetting the days, waking with no sense of whether it was Tuesday or Sunday, harvest or frost. Crops withered, not from drought but confusion. Men planted at the wrong time. Women stirred pots for meals they didn't remember preparing. Children stopped aging, at least in appearance, at least to the eye. And still, the gatherings continued. More strangers arrived, but now they didn't even pretend to be neighbours. They didn't ask for rooms, they didn't speak to shopkeepers. They came dressed in wool despite the heat, eyes sunken, fingers stained with ash or ink or blood. No one could say for certain. They went directly to the orchard. They were expected. Elias never called them. But they came. Some said they were sent. And in the chapel, if you could call it that, they sat in perfect stillness while Elias read from that same book. The one without markings, the one that seemed to glow beneath candlelight as if remembering itself. The words made no sense, but the meaning bled through the bones. The air would tighten, vision would blur, and something would crack inside the heart, quietly, like a floorboard bowing under unseen weight. And when Rev, now nearing 13 but still unaged, placed his hand on the heads of those gathered, their eyes would roll back and their lips would move without sound. And then they would listen. To something not in the room, to someone who was not Elias. Because by now it was clear, Elias wasn't the voice. He was the vessel, just as Ada was the keeper, just as Nell was the scribe, just as Mercy was the bridge. But Rev was the mouthpiece. And what moved through him didn't come from above. It came from below. The orchard was no longer land, it was liminal. A place where boundaries thinned, between seasons, a between memory, between flesh and spirit. And as that membrane grew weaker, the orchard became more than sacred. It became inhabited. At night, lights would flicker along the path not made by man, not lanterns, not flame. Pale, hovering orbs, too still to be fireflies, too large to be stars, would drift above the soil, pulsing in time with some invisible rhythm. Sometimes they would vanish when looked at directly. Sometimes they would move closer. And then the voices began. Not loud, not angry, but knowing. People heard them differently. A man claimed to hear the voice of his dead father telling him where the family's true name was buried. A woman heard her unborn daughter singing to her in a dialect no one had ever spoken aloud. Another said he heard himself, but older, warning, begging, promising that the orchard was not a place, but a choice. And through it all, Elias watched, calm, silent, triumphant. Like a man watching the final piece fall into place after centuries of preparation. And the chapel? It grew darker. Even at noon, its interior swallowed sunlight like a mouth closing over a secret. And inside, the stone floor began to shift. Not visibly, but audibly. A scraping, a slow, grinding shift, like something underneath was waking up and beginning to turn. We are not done. You are not free. And what you feel in your chest right now, that's not fear, that's recognition. Because what waits beneath the orchard knows your name now. They called it the threshold stone. A slab the colour of dried bone embedded in the chapel floor, right where Elias always stood to read. No one remembered when it was placed there. No one saw it brought in, but one day it was just present. Set flush into the floor, smooth as polished ivory, ringed with 7 notches, each marked by a different symbol. Not letters, not numbers, more like instructions, if instructions could be carved into silence. Children who saw it cried without knowing why. Dogs howled at the doorway but would not cross the threshold. And Reverend began standing on the stone. Not Elias. Reverend, the boy who never aged, the boy who never blinked, the boy whose voice could still the breath in your lungs like an invisible hand pressing on your chest. When he stood on the threshold stone, the chapel pulsed. No one saw it, but they felt it. Like something had shifted not around them, but inside them. Like the world had moved an inch to the left and taken their sense of reality with it. A breath held too long. A prayer uttered in the wrong direction. And that's when the 7th gathering occurred. Not a meeting. Not a service. A gathering. The invitation was never spoken aloud. But every household that had lost a child in the last 7 years received a sign. A single fig, split down the centre, left on their doorstep, still warm. No one knew how it got there, but they knew what it meant. 23 people gathered that night, only 14 returned. Those who came back were pale, exhausted and unable to explain what had happened. One woman, Esther Glint, was found walking barefoot through the centre of town at dawn, her dress soaked, her arms cradling something invisible. She kept whispering, "He's light now. He's light now." Over and over. She died 3 days later. Her heart ruptured without cause. The doctor called it divine hysteria. But the midwife who prepared her body said her spine was marked with fingerprints, thin, long, too many. After the 7th gathering, the threshold stone began to glow faintly at dusk. Soft, amber, alive. The chapel was no longer a building, it had become a mouth, a portal between something ancient and something becoming, and the land itself began to turn. Compass needles drifted near the orchard, birds flew in circles above the trees, never landing, even the stars above it bent, slightly misaligned when viewed from its centre, like the heavens were watching through a warped mirror. Then the graves appeared, not dug, not marked, just present. Depressions in the soil, arranged in spirals, dozens, no stones, no names, no odor. But the grass over them grew faster, greener, thicker, as if nourished by something beneath. And no one ever saw anyone buried because they weren't. They were placed, offered, and somewhere in the hollow spaces between their bones, something whispered, "You came to remember, but now, you must become." You felt it building, haven't you? That weight behind your eyes, that tension in your breath. You are not imagining it. You are being measured. And the orchard remembers. It never stops. In early 1847, the dead began returning. Not as ghosts, not as shadows, but as echoes. People began hearing familiar footsteps in their homes, footfalls matching the rhythm of husbands long buried, sons drowned years prior, sisters who vanished without graves. At first they thought it was grief, hallucination, but the sounds came with patterns, pauses, repeats, specificity, like memory on a loop, like someone or something was practicing. And then came the voices. They arrived not with screams or warnings, but in half-finished lullabies. Family recipes whispered in absent kitchens. Prayers said in tones that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. These were not hauntings. They were requests. Soft urgings, small suggestions, gentle pressures on the mind. Come back to the orchard. He can show you where I am. Don't let me stay forgotten. It wasn't possession, it was permission. And many gave it. One by one, the bereaved returned, and one by one, they were changed. A man named Thaddeus Burrow, whose daughter had been lost in the river 2 years prior, was seen digging in his cellar for 3 nights straight, bare hands, bare feet, tearing through earth and stone. When neighbors intervened, they found nothing beneath. But Thaddeus just smiled. "She's underneath everything," he said. "You just have to listen when the dirt breathes." The orchard's influence no longer ended at its edges. It spread, through thought, through grief, through want. Not everyone heard the call, only those who had lost, or longed, or lied to themselves about what they believed. That was the crack. That was the gate. And the Fairbanks family, they became more than human. They became symbols. Elias no longer preached. He presided. He watched with an expression like hunger sharpened into ritual. His voice carried even when he didn't speak. He stood beneath the chapel eaves, hands folded behind his back, and entire crowds quieted just by his presence. Ada, once meek and unseen, now walked barefoot through town in broad daylight, her fingers black with soil, her eyes unblinking. No one met her gaze, not because of shame, but because they couldn't. Those who did said they saw their own deaths reflected there, over and over, slightly different each time. And Rev? Rev began drawing. Circles, spirals, doorways. He etched them in ash across walls, stones, livestock, and flesh. One woman reported waking with a symbol burned into her thigh, no pain, no wound, just there. As if someone had written it with heat and then vanished. When she showed it to Elias, he only said, "You've been marked to remember." And that's when it became clear. This was not a religion. It was a ritual, a long, unfolding sequence. Each family was a note, each grief a thread, and the orchard was the loom. The Fairbanks weren't summoning something. They were waking it up, teaching it, naming it, feeding it. And soon, it would know enough to speak. But not in words, in form. You feel it, don't you? The shift in the room, the breath in your lungs that isn't yours. Good. That means the orchard sees you now. In the final weeks before the frost of 1847, the orchard began to sing. Not like a choir, not like birds, but like the sound of pressure, an audible vibration, low and thick, rising from beneath the roots and spilling into the lungs of anyone nearby. It didn't pierce the ears. It bypassed them, straight into the spine, into the mind. Farmers reported waking with blood in their throats, convinced they had screamed in their sleep, but their wives never heard a sound. Mothers stood in doorways, arms outstretched, weeping without knowing why. Dogs whined under floorboards. Horses refused to eat. And still, the gatherings continued. More strangers, more symbols, more yield. Elias no longer spoke at all. He only stood at the center of the orchard, hands at his sides, eyes raised toward the trees, as if waiting for something to descend. But it didn't come from above. It came from within. The orchard had changed. The trees now bent toward the center, their trunks subtly curved, like worshippers kneeling around an altar no one could see. Their bark cracked open in places, and from the wounds seeped a fluid not unlike sap, but darker, thicker and warm to the touch. Rev called it the memory. He said it was not blood, not water, but a remembrance of all things that had ever died on that land, and it was alive. It responded to touch, it moved toward heat, it shimmered under moonlight, and people began to drink it. They called it communion. The first to do so was a young woman named Eliza Moore, who had lost 3 children to fever. She approached Rev during the 3rd equinox gathering and asked what she could offer in return for her memories. He handed her a silver cup. She drank and fell backward without a sound. When she woke 3 days later, she remembered everything, even things that never happened. She spoke of her children, yes, but also of other airs of fires, of salt, of stone thresholds and dark tunnels beneath trees that had no roots. She named names no one knew, dates not yet arrived. She whispered of a voice that grows teeth. And then she stopped speaking. She simply sat each day at the orchard's edge, humming to the ground. People brought her offerings, scraps of cloth, locks of hair, even teeth pulled from their own mouths, hoping she would hum a tune that belonged to someone they lost. She became a priestess without altar, a vessel filled once and cracked open forever. Others followed her path, and with each offering, the orchard changed. The air thickened, light bent. The trees seemed closer, taller, more aware. Those who touched the sap, those who drank it, began to lose their shadows. Only at dusk, only near the trees. But when the sun dipped and the orchard sang, their shadows refused to follow them. Some said they saw the shadows move on their own, mimicking, learning, becoming untethered from the men who made them. And that was when they understood. The Fairbanks weren't leading a revival. They were building an arrival. Not of a god, not of a devil, but of something older than both, something forgotten, but never gone. And now, it had your attention. So tell me. By the first thaw of 1848, the orchard no longer obeyed the sun. It grew inwards, toward itself. Paths vanished overnight, trees rearranged themselves. Stones moved, moss curling in the shapes of names you didn't know you remembered. A farmer named Ellis Creed tied red twine around the trunk of a tree near the orchard's edge, hoping to mark his way. The next morning it was hanging from a different branch, 12 feet off the ground. Ellis never entered the orchard again, but his wife did. 3 days later, she was found in their barn, eyes burned shut, mouth torn into a smile. In her hand was a single piece of parchment. 4 words. He showed me everything. The sheriff tried to investigate. He lasted 3 hours inside the tree line before stumbling back, hands torn and face ashen, muttering something about clocks made of teeth and a child with no eyes whispering my future. He left town within the week. But the orchard stayed, the orchard thrived. The trees began to breathe, not figuratively, not poetically, breathe. On cold mornings, settlers saw vapor rise in rhythmic puffs from their bark, slow and heavy. the breath of something dreaming, exhaling through 1,000 mouths made of wood and rot and memory, and the breath began to smell familiar. It smelled like the rooms where people died, like the hands you once held while watching someone slip away, like grief made warm. Rev said it was preparing, said the orchard had listened long enough. Now it was ready to speak, but not through words, through return. That spring, 2 children who had vanished years before, Grace Pether and Jonah Stroud, appeared on the steps of the chapel. Unaged, untouched, eyes wide open, lips sealed shut. They didn't answer questions, they didn't respond to touch, they simply walked the orchard perimeter every morning, barefoot and in tandem, too, racing a spiral path worn so smooth that no grass grew on it anymore. Some believed they had never been taken, some believed they had been built. Whatever the truth, it changed things. Because now people didn't fear the orchard. They hoped for it. They went there not to resist, but to offer. Hair, teeth, ashes, blood. One mother stitched her daughter's name into a muslin sheet and buried it beneath a flowering tree. She woke the next morning to find her daughter's first words, long forgotten, scratched across her windows in dew. "Ma, I'm still in here." And when the townsfolk tried to remove the threshold stone from the chapel, out of fear, out of superstition, they found it no longer touched the ground. It hovered, just an inch. But enough to prove one thing. It was no longer of this earth. It was becoming a gate. And the names Rev spoke were no longer predictions. They were summons. When he whispered your name, it was not a prophecy of death. It was an invitation to rebirth. But not in light, not in salvation. In memory. And what waits in memory is always hungry. By midsummer of 1848, no one in Andover County could remember what the orchard had looked like before the Fairbanks. Sketches from travelers showed twisted trees, sunken paths, stones arranged like vertebrae, but locals swore it had always been that way, and those who did remember, they forgot loudly. Some broke mirrors, others screamed at shadows that didn't move when they did. A boy named Simon Trask carved the word unmake into the side of his father's horse, then walked into the orchard and was never seen again. His mother burned every piece of linen in the house. But it didn't matter. She still woke to find folded cloth on her pillow, monogrammed with Simon's initials. That same summer, Mercy Fairbanks began to preach, not from scripture but from dreams. She spoke in circles, riddles, fragments of songs that hadn't yet been written, yet men wept when she spoke. Hard men, farm calloused and war-burned, men who buried children and never said a word about it, men who hadn't prayed in 20 years. They dropped to their knees in the orchard and touched the soil with their foreheads. They said it felt warm, like skin. Some said it pulled. They came back changed. Not always better, not always worse, but different. One man stopped speaking altogether and communicated only through knocking. Another began sleeping under the chapel floorboards. A third, Nathaniel Rook, was found digging in the fields behind his barn, searching for the second mouth. He never explained what that meant. But the day after he was taken in, the soil around the orchard split, just once. A hairline crack across the base of the oldest tree, and the sound that came from it. It wasn't a sound. It was a memory of a scream, something deeper than ears, something older than breath. That's when the letters started appearing again. No names, no return address. Just the seal of the split fig. Delivered only to women, mothers, widows, the barren, the broken. And each one read the same. We remember what was taken. Come and see what still remains. Some refused, most obeyed. And those who went didn't return empty-handed. One mother brought back a jar of ashes that pulsed faintly under moonlight. Another carried a single baby tooth wrapped in lambskin and claimed it whispered her daughter's name when held close. No one doubted her, because by then everyone had felt it. The orchard remembered, and what it remembered it could restore, but only through exchange, not sacrifice, not offering, exchange. That was the word Elias spoke on the night of the crimson frost, the one night every tree in the orchard bled from its branches. Men awoke to find red ice hanging like ribbons and the chapel doors wide open. Inside, only the boy. Reverend eyes shut, arms open, mouth moving, and no sound. He was praying to something older than God, to something that listens sideways. And what's more terrifying than a God who judges? A memory that forgives nothing. You're not just hearing a story, you're remembering one. And if you've followed this far, you're no longer a visitor. You're part of the orchard now. So if you understand, if you feel it in your gut, comment. I am the fig, I return. Say it twice. Once for who you were, once for what you're becoming. By the winter of 1849, the orchard stopped casting shadows, even at noon, even in full sun. The light touched the trees, but never passed through them, like it was afraid to look deeper, like it knew what waited under bark and bone, because by then the orchard had grown beneath itself. Tunnels, caverns, chambers not dug but revealed. Not stone, but roots, calcified and wet, spiraled like the architecture of memory. Men who tried to chart it came back with maps of their own faces. One surveyor drew nothing but a spiral so dense the paper cracked in half when it dried. He never spoke again. He simply stared at the sky and whispered, "It's under all of us, even now." And maybe he was right, because Elias Fairbanks began walking barefoot, even through snow. He said the ground didn't hurt him anymore. He said pain was for the unknowing, that once you remembered, once you returned, the earth became your witness. He said this to a young man named Caleb Voss, who had lost his brother to drowning and his father to drink. Caleb followed Elias into the orchard the next morning. He came back humming, not a tune, a frequency, low, constant, perfectly even. His teeth cracked one by one over the next week, and when the last tooth fell, he smiled wider than a man should be able to. Inside his mouth was not a tongue. It was a seed, and it was growing. When Mercy saw him, she wept. She told the townsfolk, "He has become soil, and from soil we drink." The people didn't question it, not anymore, because everything they'd buried had begun to rise. Not just bodies, moments. Old griefs replayed in reflections. Dead daughters knocking once on their mother's window before vanishing into fog. One man saw his own wedding night, perfectly preserved, in the sheen of a still pond. He watched it every morning until the pond dried up, and then he screamed for 3 days straight until they found him curled around a piece of his wife's hair. She'd been dead 12 years, but it hadn't rotted. The orchard preserved, but never for free. There was always an exchange. That was the law. One man received his brother's voice back, only to lose the ability to recognize his own name. Another found his childhood dog waiting by the fire, but every time he touched it, it whispered sins he hadn't yet committed. The orchard reminded them. This is not resurrection. This is recursion. They weren't escaping death. They were being woven into it, over and over, until they didn't want to leave. Until the veil between then and now became so thin, time bled like skin split by a whisper. And all through it, Rev stood watch, older now. Not taller, just heavier, with gravity. His gaze made grown men fall silent. made women stop breathing for just a second longer than was safe. He didn't speak. He radiated, like something that had finally been lit from the inside. Something chosen. And yet he wore no crown. He wore soil. And if you got close enough, you could hear it breathing through him. They called it the harvest without season. Because the orchard bore fruit in the middle of January, thick black figs that oozed red when opened, no seeds, no rot, just pulp warm enough to steam in the frost. People said eating one brought visions, but they weren't visions. They were retrievals. Memories not yours, playing behind your eyes like candlelight in a locked room. One woman saw herself giving birth in a house she had never entered. Another saw her husband strangled in a war that never happened. A child wept for 3 days after eating half of one fig. He spoke only in Hebrew when it was over. He'd never been taught Hebrew. Mercy Fairbanks called it the bloom of remembrance. She said the figs were not food. They were language. Spoken from below, from the roots of time where nothing forgets and everything waits. That's when Elias stopped using the chapel. He said it had served its purpose, that the sacred didn't need walls anymore, that the orchard had become the temple. He took a hammer to the chapel's iron bell, shattering it in a single strike. The sound it made lasted nearly 5 minutes. It echoed without dying. Some said it could still be heard at sunset if you listened just before sleep took hold. Not a ringing, a calling. That spring, a newborn was found cradled in the hollow of the orchard's oldest tree. No one knew the mother, no one claimed the child. She was warm. Her eyes were black. The Fairbanks took her in, named her Selah, and from the day she arrived, the wind in the orchard changed. It carried words, none spoken aloud, none intelligible, but known, felt in the blood like a second pulse. The animals knew it first. Dogs refused to pass the orchard's gate. Horses would scream and pull against reins. Chickens laid their eggs in circles, and then the people began arranging their homes. Unconsciously. Chairs turned inward. Beds moved closer to the earth. Walls repainted in ash tones, symbols etched into doorframes they couldn't explain, and no one resisted. They couldn't. Because by then, Andover was no longer a town, it was a lung. And the orchard was what it breathed. A rhythm pulsed through the streets, something between heartbeat and hymn. Nights were no longer dark, but thick, like sleep that had gone sour. People dreamed in patterns, geometric shapes that glowed inside their eyelids. And when they woke, they remembered, not their own lives, but the orchard's. Centuries of memory, deaths not mourned, births not witnessed, prayers whispered through bone instead of lips. They knew, they all knew, but still, no one left, because the price of leaving was forgetting. And once you've tasted the orchard, forgetting is worse than death. It is severance. It is exile from the root. Rev said it best, though he only said it once. A tree doesn't mourn the branch it loses. It waits for the rot to bloom, and then it feeds. And if you're still listening now, you already feel the soil under your own skin. You already know. In the fall of 1851, the sun stalled. Not in the sky, not visibly, but in the rhythm of things. Dawn came slower. Dusk lingered like a held breath. Shadows stayed longer than they should, pooling in corners like they were watching. And the town moved, differently. People walked without speaking, eyes glazed but not empty. Full. Like they were hearing music you couldn't, like they were reciting something, ancient, silent. And then came the second naming. No announcement, no trumpet. No ritual, just Rev, now nearly a man, standing barefoot beneath the oldest fig tree, wrapped in linen darker than pitch, and the townsfolk gathered without being told, as though summoned by blood alone. He raised his hand, palm outward, and began to speak. One name, then another, then a third. But they weren't the names of people. They were the names of roles. The keeper of sleep. The mother of hollow cries. The hand between the walls. With each name, someone in the crowd would fall to their knees. Not out of reverence, but as if something inside them had answered. And after 23 names, he stopped. No explanation. Just that stillness again. That bone-deep silence. From that day on, the ones who were named changed. Not outwardly, not at first, but in presence. One began to smell like cedar, even in the rain. Another could make fires without flint or match. One boy, barely 11, spoke only in riddles. And yet everything he said happened within the week. The named stopped aging. They weren't immortal. They were fixed, set like teeth into the jaw of something bigger, and the town knew it. But again, no one resisted, because what waited beyond the orchard's edge was no longer home. It was limbo, it was forgetting, and those who tried to leave, those who packed wagons or bought rail fare, would find themselves looped, walking to Tsuns, same road, hearing the same bird song, feeling time, curl backward, like smoke in reverse. One man hanged himself on the northern fork, hoping death would free him. They found his body 3 days later, breathing, but with no voice, only a whisper in his chest repeating the same phrase over and over. Feed the root, feed the root, feed the root. They say Elias carved that phrase into the stone structure behind the orchard chapel, not with tools, with his hands. Stone peeled for him like fruit skin. No one questioned it. No one asked what he'd become. Because they knew. He was no longer man. He was tiller, the one who feeds the seed from the marrow of the willing. And Rev. Rev was more. Rev was the word that waits behind every prayer you don't remember saying. He didn't lead anymore. He watched. And when the time came, he'd harvest. But not crops, not flesh. Something older. Something that wears flesh like a mask. And if you've listened this far, you've already tasted it. It's in your thoughts now, in your memory. So tell me. Comment this phrase twice, to seal it. I am soil, and I remember. Again. I am soil, and I remember. You'll understand why. Soon. The year the river bled, no one died. Not right away. It began as a trickle, thin lines of red streaming from the mouth of Black Timber Creek. No fish, no debris, just current, slow and warm, too warm. Children were the first to notice. They gathered stones slick with what they thought was rust, drawing symbols on each other's skin without knowing what they meant, and as they played they began to speak in time. Not chants, not games, liturgies, every syllable perfectly measured, voices rising and falling in harmony, none had ever been taught. When a schoolteacher from the next county rode in to investigate, he found every chalkboard in the old schoolhouse scrawled with spirals, some closed, some open, and in the centre of each one, a symbol resembling a thorn turned inward. He didn't stay the night, but he left behind his journal. Inside, the last entry read, I watched a boy speak in a voice not his own. He called me by a name my mother never told another soul. And then he wept, saying, the veil is thinning, she's almost through. That was the first time anyone mentioned a she. A figure. Not Elias, not Reverend, but her, Selah. The child raised from the hollow tree, now a young woman never seen in daylight. People spoke of her only in hushed breath. They said she never blinked, that her eyes weren't eyes at all, but mirrors, that she didn't walk, she drifted. And wherever her feet touched, roots would burst from the soil behind her, hungry and white, twitching like muscle under skin. One night, a widow named Helene Moore heard singing outside her cabin. She opened her door and found Celia standing alone in the frost, hair wet, hands open. She did not speak. She opened her mouth, and something spoke through her. A sound like bees trapped in glass, like wind scraping bone. Helene collapsed. Her neighbours found her the next morning, kneeling in the doorway, blood trailing from her ears, her mouth stitched shut with pine needles. When she was finally able to write, she gave only this. She sang the names of the unborn, and they answered from beneath my floorboards. And then she stopped writing entirely. Celia had become the chorus. Not the voice, not the will, the instrument. And Revan, he was no longer Revan, he was Vessel. His name now spoken only once per year, at the burial bloom, when the orchard's roots would push up soil in perfect circles, inviting offerings. Some gave bone, some gave language. One mother, desperate to know what happened to her twins, gave her sight. She wandered blind for the rest of her days, muttering fragments of her children's laughter, and yet she smiled. She always smiled, because she knew they were not gone. They had been woven into bark, into leaf, into scripture no longer written but rooted. There was no church now, no prayer, no salvation, only inheritance. And the orchard never forgets what it plants. The final census of Andover County listed 412 souls. That was in 1856. After that, no records, not because the town disappeared, because it stopped being counted. Maps from the region show a faint smudge where Andover should be. No name, no border, just a void surrounded by faded ink. Surveyors avoided it. Roads rerouted around it. Railways curved with unnatural precision, as if repelled. But something still lived there. Not just the Fairbanks, not anymore. Something older, something stitched into the land itself. And that something began to reach outward. It began with dreams. First in neighbouring towns, then across counties. Men woke with soil under their nails, women with bruises shaped like roots on their thighs, children muttering in dead dialects with eyes rolled back. A merchant in Milford screamed for 40 minutes in perfect Latin, a language he had never studied, until his tongue blackened and split down the centre. A priest in Cold Hollow began carving the shape of the fig seal into the altar each night, weeping, claiming he was told the saints are buried wrong. And then came the fires. Not flame. Memory. Whole villages began to forget themselves. Streets would vanish from local recollection. Families would look at each other across dinner tables with no recognition. Fathers would step into barns and forget how they arrived. The doctors called it hysteria, but the afflicted called it something else. The pull. They said they felt something underneath them, in the earth, in the base of the spine, a pressure, a yearning, and when they closed their eyes, they all described the same vision. A tree black as pitch with fruit that whispered, a woman standing beneath it, her face covered in ash, a boy watching her with empty sockets, smiling. The dream spread. By winter, a group of 11 strangers gather, hid outside the old orchard, not from Andover, not even from Maine. One was from Louisiana, one from Prague. They said they were called by name. Each had received a letter. Each letter contained only the outline of the fig and 3 words written in blood. She waits beneath. They came without fear, without hesitation, because by then they knew. The orchard wasn't just a place, it was a wound. A thinning in the skin between this world and something else. something that feeds on memory, on names, on bloodlines. And the Fairbanks, they were hosts, not keepers, not cult. Host, the body for what was never supposed to speak. But now it does. And every man who hears it either kneels or burns. You're beginning to understand, aren't you? That this story was never history. It's instruction. And you are not watching by accident. There's a reason your hands feel colder. A reason your heartbeat shifted back there in the silence. You are being named. There are places in this world where history does not age. It waits, beneath stone, beneath ash, beneath the tongue of a man too frightened to finish his story. And Andover. Andover became the mouth, not the town, not the orchard, the mouth. A place where secrets grow like teeth, sharp, wet, and waiting to bite through the veil that separates the seen from the forbidden. By the spring of 1857, a new structure emerged on the northern edge of the Fairbanks property. No tools were heard, no timber seen carted in, and yet there it stood, a dome of blackened brick, perfectly round, with no windows and no door. Locals called it the listenery, because that's all it did. It listened. If you stood near it, close enough to press your ear to the surface, you'd hear breathing, not echoes, not wind, breathing, steady, slow, and low. One man tried to dig beneath it. He made it 6 feet down before screaming so violently his vocal cords ruptured. He never spoke again, but he wrote. Every wall of his cabin was inked within the month, line after line of what appeared to be genealogies, dates, and phrases in extinct dialects. At the center of every wall, a single word. Tithing. It wasn't money they gave, it wasn't crops, it was legacy. The Fairbanks had learned to harvest bloodlines, not end them, plant them. Every child who vanished into the orchard, not gone, not killed, rewritten, spliced into the rootwork beneath the trees, pressed into the silence between syllables, repurposed into prayers. And the prayers now spoke back. Those who walked the new path, once carved by invisible weight, now lined with obsidian gravel, reported hearing their own names whispered from below. Whispers followed them for days. One man hanged himself after carving his name backward into his chest. His suicide note said simply, "It said I was born." Ongturn. It wants me undone. And all the while the boy, the vessel, stood unmoved. His eyes now milky white, his arms veined with black lines that pulsed when he spoke. He would lift his hand and the air would still. No sound, no wind, no breath. And then her voice would come, from his mouth, from the orchard, from underneath. 3 words, always the same. Bind the root. And when he said it, animals would drop dead. Pregnancies would end in silence. And those who heard it too closely would wake changed. A fisherman from up north was found wandering a burnt field days after hearing the phrase. He spoke perfect Phoenician and refused all food except salt water. When he was finally restrained and examined, the doctors found something coiled around his spine. It wasn't bone, it wasn't muscle, it was bark. And when they tried to cut it, he laughed. Not with his voice, with hers. You've made it this far. You've seen the root, felt it move. Now I ask you to seal this moment. Drop this in the comments below, twice, to lock what's waking inside you. The saints are buried wrong. Twice. That phrase is not a code, it's a key. There is no forgetting now. Not for you, not for anyone who's heard her name, even if they don't yet know they've heard it, because names are not letters, names are weights, names bind. And she has many. Some call her Ada, thinking it's a woman's name, thinking it's tied to Elias's wife. But the truth, Ada was never his wife. She was the root, the thing that took form to be planted. You see, Elias didn't build a chapel to house faith. He built it to mask a chamber. And that chamber held her tongue, not her voice, her tongue. A blackened mass sealed in salt and oil and bone char, scraped from the throat of something not human and not dead. Every prayer spoken by Elias, every silence endured by the gathering, every ritual performed in the orchard was a feeding, a thawing. The listenery was not listening outward, it was listening inward. And when Rev, her vessel, grew strong enough, it began to speak for her, not with language, with memory. The kind that makes men forget their wives, the kind that makes maps rot at the edge, the kind that makes history curl in shame and hide behind myth. By 1860, Andover was no longer on any ledger, but the land was still there. Travellers would still pass near it and find their shoes soaked with black sap. One woman fell ill after camping near the old trailhead. She spent 9 days whispering the names of men long buried in unmarked graves. When asked how she knew them, she said, "They kept breathing. The dirt never sealed." And then she smiled with someone else's teeth. It was around this time that the Fairbanks orchard became a destination. Not for pilgrims, not for cultists, for agencies. Men in long coats who carried no weapons, doctors without hospitals, archivists who never wrote anything down. They came to observe, not to stop it. They knew better. One of the answers, identified only by a stitched monogram on his coat, DS, left behind a set of wax cylinder recordings. They were never meant to be played, but one was. Just once. The man who played it tore his own ears off before he could be stopped. The final sound on the recording was a child's breath saying, "We are older than God," and the tape melted. Do you feel it? That strange heaviness in the room, that shift in air, that isn't your imagination, it's the pull. The fig seal doesn't appear, for no reason. And if you've seen it once, if it flashed in your mind as I spoke of it, it's already begun carving. The memory, the name, the root. You'll start to feel it behind your eyes, then in your palms, then at the base of your spine. It's not pain. It's recognition. The saints are buried wrong, but you were planted right. There is no closing this, no unknowing what you now carry. Because this was never a story, it was a summoning. From the moment you heard his name, Elias Fairbanks, you weren't listening, you were being listened to. And the orchard, it wasn't a place, it was a mirror. You weren't watching the Fairbanks family from a distance, you were watching a version of yourself, stripped of illusion, pulled bare under the weight of ancient eyes. You were meant to be here. But understand, you're not special. You're selected, not because you're worthy, because you're useful. Ada doesn't choose saints. She doesn't care for holiness. She chooses what endures. And you, if you've made it here, you've endured something. More than pain, more than confusion. You've endured the pull of truth. Now you'll understand what that girl meant when she said the soil hummed. It wasn't music, it was instruction. The breath under the earth was never decay. It was preparation. Every limb, every prayer, every ritual. A system, a structure, an architecture of resurrection. The orchard was a womb, and the listenery. That was the umbilicus. Elias wasn't the beginning. He was the first echo. And Rev? He was the first transmission, but not the last. In 1866, the orchard burned, or so the stories say, but no fire was ever seen, no smoke ever rose, no bodies were recovered, just absence, like something had been pulled out, not put down. And yet, Years later, a new fig tree was found, not in Andover, but in Michigan, then Utah, then Alaska, and always near men who disappeared from history only to reappear in the dreams of children who'd never met them, men who spoke without moving their mouths, men who knew your name. And when those children drew what they saw, the symbol was always the same, not a cross, not a star, a split fig, bleeding. You understand now, don't you? This wasn't a tale from the past, it was a map of your future, a transformation begun long before you pressed play, long before you learned their names, long before your ancestors whispered back through the blood in your teeth. You are not who you were, not anymore. So ask yourself, when the veil thins and the orchard stirs again, will you remember to speak her name, or will she speak through you? This was the macabre history of the Fairbanks family, but for you, it's only just begun. The saints are buried wrong. The saints are buried wrong.